Taylor Swift, this one's for you. So recently, I've seen a lot of videos and TikToks talking about some of the books that Taylor Swift has read, and some of them are just like talking about those books, and then other videos that I've seen are people actually reading Taylor Swift's like favorite books. However, while I was watching those, I was like, well, I kind of want to do that too, but I also want to do a video where I recommend Taylor Swift some books that I think she would like. So the odds of Taylor Swift ever seeing this video are slim to none. However, I think this might be also a very helpful video to some people who want to read books that kind of give off a Taylor Swift-esque vibe. So from my collection of books, I have chosen 7 books that I think Taylor Swift would absolutely love. Also, these are in no particular order, so we'll just kind of start off from the top. And the first book that I have on this pile is Radio Silence by Alice Oseman. And I chose this book because it definitely gives me kind of earlier Taylor Swift vibes from like debut era, Fearless era, even Speak Now era, something that's kind of a bit younger. And this is also definitely a coming of age story, and I feel like Taylor Swift, even in her later albums like Folklore and Evermore, she definitely does still dive into that kind of theme. So I figured that Radio Silence would be perfect for her, and I also feel like it has that kind of similar vibe to the Sally Rooney books that she really likes, but this is kind of more YA and she might really enjoy it as well. So if you've never read Radio Silence, it's about Frances, and she is a teenager and she is graduating from high school and about to transfer into this new life. So typically the narrative is that you graduate from high school and then you jump right into college, and that is kind of your path. But for Frances, she's not really sure where she wants to go. She's not really sure if she even wants to go to college. So she's still trying to figure out her life. But she's also very obsessed with this podcast that's run by someone who is anonymous. And so she doesn't know who the podcaster is. But then she meets someone, and just like this entire story kind of flows outward, and I love it so much. There's not really a lot of romance in this book. There are some mentions of romance, but it's very, very little. There's no like main romance plot, which I really enjoy. And even though I know Taylor Swift loves love and loves romance and stuff like that, I think that she might actually really enjoy this book. The next one is also not very romance heavy, but I definitely got big Taylor Swift vibes when I read it, and that is Here We Are Now by Jasmine Warga. And this book, mainly the reason I would recommend it to Taylor Swift is that it deals a lot with music and the way that music affects relationships, and even the way the music industry affects relationships, and you know, just like that entire dynamic. And I find it so interesting, and I think that Taylor Swift would as well. So basically this book is about a teenager named Talia, and she has never known her father. Her mother just refuses to tell her who her father is, but Talia has an inkling that it might be one of the most famous rock stars that is just, you know, very popular within this book. And so she ends up writing to this rock star and is like, hey, I think that we're related. You might be my dad. Let me know if this is even possible. And suddenly he shows up at her doorstep and is like, hey, I'm your dad. This is like happening. And it's just so crazy, and I absolutely loved this book. And I loved all of like the family dynamics, and I especially loved just getting to dive into this dynamic between a daughter and a father that have never met, never known each other, didn't even really know that each other existed. And I think that Taylor's also really interested in family dynamics, especially ones that aren't stereotypical family dynamics, and I think she would really, really appreciate this book, not only for the family dynamics and not only for the music, but just how well written it is. And I could totally see her writing songs that pertain to this book. The next book in this stack is another music book, and that is Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I would be shocked if I heard that Taylor has never read this book. Like, I genuinely believe that Taylor has probably read this book, she just hasn't talked about it, or she just hasn't had the time to pick it up. Either way, I think that Taylor would absolutely love this book for a couple of reasons. You know, first of all, the music, that would be like the biggest draw, I think, to her. But also, this definitely has a lot of feminist themes, and Taylor is a huge feminist, and I think that she would really, really enjoy this book. And because it deals so heavily with music, I think that would really interest her, especially since it has the lyrics in the back of the book, and you know, it's very, very tied to music and the music industry and a band and like these very, very personal lives of these band members. I think that would totally interest her, and I could totally see Taylor just embodying this Daisy Jones aesthetic. And low-key, I kind of want Taylor to enter into like a more rock and roll-esque era. I would love that so much. I just want, you know, a rock version of We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together. Please let that happen on Red. I know it's far-fetched, but you know what? The rock version that she did on tour was just chef's kiss. So yeah, I feel like she would really, really enjoy Daisy Jones and the Six, and would enjoy the message that this book brings. And it's kind of all about, you know, sticking true to yourself and independence and feminism, and those are definitely things that I feel like Taylor Swift stands for. It also has a lot to do with Daisy owning her music and like being genuine and truthful with her music, and that's definitely something that Taylor Swift is passionate about. The next book is another one that I think Taylor would love for the feminism, and that is The Midnight Bargain by C.L. Polk. I just recently read this one, and yes, it is adult fantasy. I'm not sure if Taylor really reads any sort of fantasy books. I've never seen her recommend one or even talk about reading one, besides I think she might have read The Hunger Games. I'm sure she did, honestly, because she did do like a song for The Hunger Games, so I'm sure she read it. But besides that and Harry Potter, I think that's probably the most fantasy I've ever seen her read. And I mean, you can kind of debate whether The Hunger Games is fantasy or not. I think it has fantastical elements because it is dystopian, but I guess it's more sci-fi. Anyway, I've never really seen her read like a true blue fantasy book, so I would really be interested to see how she would react to a book like The Midnight Bargain, because it definitely has very strong feminist values and themes, and I think that this would be a book that Taylor would really, really enjoy. So this book is kind of difficult to explain, but basically in this fantasy world, women cannot use the magic that they're born with. People think that it will negatively affect not only them, but also any baby that they carry. So women as a whole are just not allowed to use their magic beyond a certain point. And the main character is not happy about that. She does want to be able to help her family and support her family, but she also wants to be able to freely use her magic and become one of the first female sorceresses. But in this world, those two desires are kind of at odds with each other. And I feel like that's something that Taylor Swift would really, really enjoy exploring. And I just think that she would really enjoy this book. It's also so beautifully written and so engaging and so interesting, but it's not like so fantasy that it's alienating or a non-fantasy reader wouldn't be able to get into it. I feel like it's super accessible, and since I don't think that Taylor is such a big fantasy reader, it'd probably be perfect for her. The next book is one that whenever I see it, whenever I think about it, I always think about Taylor Swift, and that is Everything Leads to You by Nina LaCour. And this is a sapphic contemporary romance, YA, and when I read this, I listened to Red by Taylor Swift literally the entire time I read this book. It was perfect for it. And so now whenever I think about this book, I always have to think of Taylor. I always have to think of the album Red. And I think Taylor would really, really love this book because it is so cinematic. It's so beautifully written, and I love the romance. It's so, so good. and I would love to see her read like a sapphic book, you know, see her really enjoy a sapphic book. This book is set in Los Angeles and it follows the main character Emmy, and she is in high school, but she is also working as a set designer for movies. And one day when she's at an estate sale for this famous film director that has recently died, she ends up finding this letter that is addressed to his daughter, his estranged daughter. And so Emmy takes this letter and tries to find that woman, but ends up finding out that that woman is actually dead, and so she has to go find her daughter that never even knew who her grandfather was, you know, where she came from. So it's such an interesting book. I loved the plot so much, and like I said, it's very cinematic because it does deal a lot with the film industry, because Emmy is a set designer, and there are little snippets from like the movie that she is currently set designing for. And it's just so beautiful, it's so memorable, it just lives in my memory all the time. And I feel like it just gives me such big Taylor Swift vibes. She would absolutely love this book. The next book I feel like is totally obvious. Like, I feel like if Taylor Swift hasn't read this book, I just have to ask her some questions, because I'm like, how did you write any of Folklore and Evermore? Because this book literally is Folklore and Evermore inside of you know, book with pages. And that book is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. And oh my gosh, I don't know how Taylor wrote either of those albums without reading this book first, because they are just so eerily accurate to both of those albums. And this book, it's just, I don't know how she did it. There's no way that she was able to write Cardigan or Ivy or Cowboy Like Me without reading this book. I just don't know how she did it. So if she hasn't read this book, maybe she's read it, maybe I'm wrong, but if she hasn't read it, I need her to read this book immediately, because she's gonna lose her mind when she reads this book and is like, oh my gosh, I literally basically wrote it in Folklore and Evermore. What's going on? If somehow you don't know what this book is about, this is about Addie LaRue, and she ends up making a deal with the god of the night. And that's kind of bad, because typically those deals don't end up being very good. And so she wishes for freedom, but instead she gets an immortal life, and no one remembers her. They will meet her and then she's gone for a couple seconds, and she comes back and they forgot she ever existed. So it's kind of a difficult and frustrating life. So she lives for about 300 years, and then in the present tense she ends up meeting this man named Henry, and he runs a bookstore, and he is the first person in the past 300 years that is able to remember Addie. And so that's like a huge deal, and basically that's like the entire plot of the book. I loved it so much. It's so emotional, so poignant, so beautifully written. And Taylor, this book was written for you. It was amazing. I know she's not watching this video, but honestly, this book has Taylor Swift written all over it. And the very last book that I think Taylor Swift should absolutely read, this is actually the book that kind of sparked my idea for this video, besides, you know, watching all these other videos. This was the first book that I thought of, and that is Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reid. I feel like this book just screams Taylor. Like, she should absolutely 100% read it. And it's kind of for the same reason as Radio Silence. You know, Radio Silence is like a coming of age story for teenagers, whereas Such a Fun Age is more of a coming of age story for, you know, mid to late 20s, you know, an adult basically. And I really, really love those kind of stories because you don't get them very often. And I feel like Taylor definitely does write coming of age songs for any point in your life up until like your 30s where she's at. So, you know, I can't wait to hear, you know, music from her in the next couple of years, because I'm sure she will just continue to write these like coming of age songs that are so relatable and just so necessary. I love seeing these kind of narratives written. I also feel like this is just a book that is really good for white people to read in general, or just non-black people to read in general. And I think that she could learn a lot from this book. It just definitely opens your eyes to the disparity between being black and then having white privilege. It's just so interesting, and also just such a really engaging book. I loved it so much. I read this in just a couple of days and I enjoyed every moment of it. It was so interesting and so well written. I was just like, I fell in love with this book last year, and I can't believe that Taylor hasn't read this book yet. I think she would really enjoy this book, and I know that if she read it, she would probably never shut up about it. So yeah, these are the books that I think that Taylor Swift would absolutely love if she read them. She needs to read them. Taylor, if you're watching, I have a reading list for you. In the comments down below, let me know if you've read any of these books and if you also agree with me that Taylor Swift should read them. Also down below, let me know if there's any books that I missed that you think that Taylor would love to read. And I hope you all enjoyed this video, and if you did, go ahead and give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Also go ahead and follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Goodreads, Storygraph, TikTok. All the links are down below in the description, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye! Ooh, I thought it'd be me and you. Oh.